Good evening. My name is Keisha Evans, and I'm substituting for your regular host, Miss Jennifer, who is on a much-needed vacation. Tonight's show is a real treat. The subject is the Tuskegee Airmen. We will be interviewing Mr. David Cuningham, who is president of the William Bill Campbell, chapter, San Francisco, of the Tuskegee Airmen Association. He is also the son of one of the Tuskegee Airmen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, start off and tell us, what is this whole business of Tuskegee Airmen? How did it start?
It started back in the 30s when black people were flying airplanes just like other people were, and young men wanted to learn how to fly, and they were denied because of their race. And there were challenges by somebody that flew across country and got to meet with some of the politicians in Washington, who says, well, if you can fly this thing all the way across country, then we can maybe get you going and something like that. That gentleman they talked to was would have been President Truman later on.
And now, were the Tuskegee Airmen the first pilots?
No, there was one that flew in World War I, and that was Eugene Bullard. And there was a picture of him over there on the first panel over there, upper left-hand corner. And he flew with the French because he couldn't.
Let's go look at the picture.
Okay. Okay, this is him right here. Kind of favors Wesley Snipes, or the other way around, actually. But he flew with the French and was highly honored for what he had done for during World War I. When the Americans came into the war, he offered his services to train the pilots, the American pilots who had absolutely no combat experience in air-to-air combat.
Was that his offer accepted?
No, he was not, because of his race. Now, there were other white pilots that were able to help the Americans, but not him.
What about women? Were there any women pilots?
Funny you should ask. This is Bessie Coleman, and Bessie Coleman was our first African-American international licensed pilot. She too went to France to learn how to fly. And her base in the United States was in Chicago. That's where she got her funding to go to France to learn. She came back and flew on a regular basis. She barnstormed for quite a bit, and unfortunately she died in one of the events where the plane was turned inverted, and she fell out because she's a tiny lady.
Well, what about the Tuskegee Airmen? Where did that start from? Did that start also in the 30s?
Yeah, it did, because the pressure was on to get something going, because World War II actually started in 1938, and the Americans had to start preparing for that war, and the black support said, well, we need to get our young people going. So, and it was promised by the president, if the black vote went towards President Roosevelt, which it did, and so he was expected to support black aviation and other things as well.
Now, before that, in 1925, what happened about the military accepting black people as pilots and things?
Well, there was a secret paper that came out saying that the blacks were incapable of handling complex equipment. There was cowardice. They said the brains were too small, and just everything wrong, and absolutely wrong. And that was everything that they had said was disproven during the war.
How did they move past that? Who was instrumental in getting that?
Well, the train, what do you call it? The
Pullman
porters. They had a strong union, and they allowed they gave power to the people to get the program going for they call it the CPTP, which is I can't remember the acronym, but it was Civilian Pilot Training Corps. And so they weren't trying to train military men just yet, but they were trying to get some pilots trained to become trainers.
And that was A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters Union?
Now, I will say that one of the gentlemen, he's over here. This gentleman was part of the CPTP program. His name is Charles Alfred Anderson, and he was the chief flight instructor for all of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was a self-taught pilot. He had to teach himself because none of the people would teach him how to fly. So what he did was he worked in odd jobs at airports, listening to the stories of the pilots, and when he got enough money, he went and bought himself a cheap airplane. And they didn't have paved runways like they have now. They're all grass strips. So what he did was he'd start the engine and taxied the plane down the strip, turned it around, taxied back, and he kept going and coming back till he got comfortable with that, started going a little faster and faster and faster, and eventually the plane took off. And he had to get up there, and he's up there and said, okay, now how do I bring it down?
And what was his name again?
Chief, well, we call him Chief, but his name is Charles Alfred Anderson. And in this picture, this is Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, she was the one that was instrumental in getting a CPTP program into the cadets. So she got the cadet program going.
Okay. Okay. How did the Tuskegee Airmen program begin?
Well, it was at 6 different colleges, and the government decided that was too many. They couldn't control that, so they whittled it down to Tuskegee being the one that they wanted it to go to. Why they chose Tuskegee, I'm glad they did, but I don't know why they chose that one, other than it was in the heart of the racist states.
Yeah.
One of the worst.
Yeah.
Alabama.
Why did the black pilots train at Tuskegee as opposed to other places in the country?
Well, once they settled on one of the colleges, then that was it. They had an airport there. The program was already going, and all they needed to do was just bring the military in and set up the training for the military.
Couldn't they go to where the military was at Fort Sill or other places?
No, it was segregated.
Okay.
That simple.
That simple.
In other words, there were 2 militaries. There was a black military and a white military.
And after the Tuskegee pilots were trained and mechanics, then what happened?
And well, they started the actual training for the squadrons before the war started. This was in 1941. The first class graduated in early 42, but the war for us did not start until December 7th of 1941. And when they got started, then they had to build their first squadron, the 99th Squadron, up to 39 pilots. And once they got those, then they were legally built to go into combat, but nobody wanted them over in combat. Nobody wanted to control what they were doing. And it wasn't until about 6 months later that they were invited to go to North Africa and help support the ground fighting.
And so they actually supported other fighting throughout the war.
Ground fighting, yes. But they never had an aerial combat condition. Not until much later.
About how many people went through the Tuskegee program?
There were, I don't know how many started out, but there were roughly about 1,000 pilots that completed the training.
Were there more than pilots that were trained in the program?
The mechanics and all of the support. They say that there was somewhere between 13 and 15 support people for each pilot. So the program was somewhere around 15 to 16,000 people.
And then what happened after the war? Was there a lot of publicity? Did people announce what the Tuskegee Airmen had done?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, all of the things, all of the positive things that the blacks had done in World War II were held back because they said it was confidential.
So there was no publicity.
None at all.
About
Not until the time frame that's allowed for that kind of information. It wasn't until early 70s, early 1970s.
that the information came out.
And that it was free to come out.
It was freed because it was classified.
Correct.
Are there still any of the original pilots still living?
Yes, there are. We're just not in our chapter.
Okay.
And we had 19 at one time.
About approximately how many are still living?
We have no way to know. See, not everybody joined the organization, and we've allowed for the mechanics and the all the support people to be considered original Tuskegee Airmen. Whereas when the organization first started, they were only allowing the fighter pilots.
Pilots.
The ones that went to combat. Interestingly enough, well, I'll talk about that a little later. No, I'll talk about it now. There were actually 3 groups in the Tuskegee training, 3 groups of pilots. There were the fighter pilots, which got all of the glory with all of the red tails.
Yeah.
The red tail, and that's a P-51 Mustang there. There was also bomber pilots. They flew a B-25 aircraft. This gentleman right here, he was one of the first that completed the training for the bomber.
That's not Les Williams.
Yes, Les Williams right there.
Oh, he wrote a book also. Yes. Oh, yeah, it sure is. He lived in this area.
Yeah, not too far from here.
And had a dance studio, and yes.
And was a lawyer.
And was a lawyer, that's right. So he was a bomber pilot.
Yes, he was. But the bomber pilots had issues with racism too, and they had well, some people called it a mutiny, and some people called it just standing up for their rights. 101 pilots and navigators all chose to go to the club, an officers' club that wasn't supposed to be theirs.
Okay, a segregated one.
It was segregated illegally. And so all 101 of them were put under house arrest. All of them were threatened with a firing squad. And the government stepped in and said, no, you won't.
Okay, so we had the bombers, the fighter pilots. What was the third group?
Third group was called liaison. They were forward observation pilots for artillery. Now, all the bombers and the fighters, bombers and the fighters were Army Air Corps. The liaison forward observation pilots were regular Army, because what their job was be spotter pilots for artillery. You see, with a segregated military, you not only had pilots, but you had artillery, you had tanks, you had ships. There was one ship that was almost 100% African American.
And that was Navy?
That was Navy. It was called the USS Macon.
Wow.
Okay, that's another story. I don't know that one as well.
Yeah, okay.
But nevertheless, this is my father right here, and that's what he did. He was a forward observation for artillery. And he got his training at Tuskegee, his basic training. He actually got his went to OCS in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, went to Tuskegee for his basic flight training, and came back to Fort Sill to retrain, because the training had been substandard for him.
Say that again. He was at Tuskegee and trained.
And it's in his records
and
that
then
he was there.
He had to
be retrained when he got back to Fort Sill.
Because
they didn't feel that they had to be trained as well as the fighter pilots.
Okay, so the training was not up to par.
Right. And again, there was only 3 classes that went through there, and only 51 pilots total for those 3 classes. He was in the 2nd class. And one of the things that most people don't know is that there were black pilots in the South Pacific during fighting the Japanese.
How do you know that?
That's where my dad was.
Yeah, your dad was in the South. Wow, what a story. There's so much information here that I'm happy that you've got it together in such a way to present it. But let's talk a little bit about you. Tell us, how did you get involved in this?
I actually, there was a air show sponsored by the Tuskegee Airmen back in 1991, and I think it was October or November, and it was held at Oakland. And I came to that, and I found a group called the Bay Area Black Pilots Association, and I ended up joining them a month later. And it wasn't until 6 or 7 years after that that I said, well, maybe I should join the Tuskegee Airmen. And so I did. And I was a member, just a member for a number of years, and then one of my friends became the president and asked if I'd be the vice president. And then she decided she wanted to retire and left it to me.
Look what our friends do for us.
And now I'm in my 12th year.
12 years. And do you speak often for groups around the whole story of the Tuskegee?
Whenever I'm invited.
Okay. All right. And tell us about the work of the association.
Well, we have two functions. Our number one function is to let the world know, or let everybody know, of what the Tuskegee Airmen did for this country. The second is to get the youth involved in aviation. And we like the pilot part of it, but we also like to have the mechanics as well. So not everybody not everybody can be a pilot.
What means do you have for recruiting people?
We've let the class go for a little while because we had a summer flight academy for a number of years. Our original airmen started our summer flight academy back in 1995, and we've had as many as 23 students in a class.
What happened in the summer flight academy?
Well, for 2 weeks we give training in aviation. We'll give them a history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and then we'll give them actual flight training, the ground school portion, as well as some actual flight time that they can log. They actually fly the planes. The students do.
Very impressive. Very impressive.
And we're trying to get that started up again.
Have you ever had young ladies involved in that program?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had one young lady that was in a class that I was teaching. She and another young man, they were Latino, but they both had the passion to go all the way to airlines.
Is that right? Okay.
I did have one young man when I was at my church, and we had what do you call it,
Career night?
Career day, and I had my booth set up there. Young man came with a little baby in his arms. He said, I went through the Summer Flight Academy some years before, it was before I was a member, and he said that if it wasn't for those 2 weeks, there's no telling where he could have been. He could have been on the streets doing whatever. And because of those 2 weeks, he became an engineer and a family man.
Okay, so you have a lot of successes under your belt, huh?
Yes, in fact, our vice president now was one of my students.
Oh.
And he is working his way towards the airlines.
Is that what many of the ex-pilots have done? Have they moved into the airlines, or do they just kind of retire?
Most of them just retire, but I tell you, right now, since they're getting too old to fly for the commercial airlines, it would behoove them to stay with it, to train the young people, the ones that are coming up.
Where is your chapter located?
We meet in Hayward, at the Hayward Airport.
And tell us about what just happened on 880 because of the work of your chapter.
Well, we had a company that moved into the south side of the Hayward Airport. They needed a street, and the street would have been an extension of Clowater, which is right off of Winton. And a friend of mine who is a resident of Hayward decided to ask for that name to be Tuskegee Airmen Drive, and they named it. But just like my dad had to go through retraining, they had to rename that street because they messed up the name. They said Tuskegee Drive. Oh. And I petitioned to have it changed to Tuskegee Airmen Drive. In due process, it was succeeded. It succeeded. It is now Tuskegee Airman Drive.
And we can see it when we drive down
Winton.
off of 880. Wow. What about the fight for the Hayward Airport? You were involved in some work there?
Well, I had to challenge the city council to make that happen. And it succeeded unanimously.
Very good, very good. Can we also close our interview talking about some of the high points give us something that you, and I know there are a lot of high points.
Well, there's a lot of high points. The one you're probably alluding to is the Congressional Gold Medal. Okay, back in 2006, one of the politicians, a representative, had talked to one of the senators about granting the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, and by due process, it went through a lot of rigmarole for as a bill would go through. And in 2007, they granted, in March 29th, they granted the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. And I was there to escort my mother, she's a widow, to get our Congressional Gold Medal.
And how many people came under that Congressional Gold Medal?
We had 300 people that received the Congressional Gold Medal. Some were mechanics, some were pilots, and a handful of widows.
And you were there?
I was there as an escort. And we had 8 from my chapter, 8 of the originals from my chapter.
8 originals, okay. And that happened. Now, are there other people besides the 300 who qualify?
Yes, yes. There were a lot that maybe couldn't travel, maybe they weren't able to travel because of other things going on. But whatever, a lot of the chapters representatives that were there would take the gold medals back to their people there.
Everybody got the medal. That's wonderful.
And somebody paid for all of those medals. Somebody out of their own pocket.
Oh, is that right? Do you know who that?
I have no idea who it was. No,
Marvelous.
none at all.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about the training school that you had. How was that financed?
We had to beg, steal, borrow, whatever. Well, we didn't steal. But, but we tried, and we worked with a flight school up in Oakland. That's where we used to be, but we're trying to get it going in the Hayward Airport area. Good
contribution from, and I guess you being a volunteer know that a lot of volunteers come out of their own pocket.
Yes, that's true.
But it worked.
It did.
Worked. Do you still have your dad's Congressional Medal of Honor?
Yes, I do.
And is it available to your children and other people? Or?
Yes. I usually bring it out. I forgot it today.
Okay, all right. But that's a wonderful story. And I guess it's impressive to me that you're continuing the work that was started so long ago, but you're continuing. And you're a military man yourself, is
That's
that
right.
correct?
I'm a Vietnam veteran in the United States Navy.
And what field were you in?
Avionics.
And what field are you in now?
Electronics. 48 years of it.
Still going strong.
Still going, but I don't know how strong.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is a pleasure to talk with you and hear your stories, because I'm sure you have a lot more. But is anything that we should know as members of the public, some of who are just learning about the Tuskegee Airmen program other than what they saw in the movie? Is there anything we really need to know that might be left out?
I can't, well, just about everything has been covered, but those guys were really special. A lot of the things that, what captures my attention is those guys were just like all of our young people in their early 20s. You know, all very aggressive, very excited about something. And when they got the chance to learn how to fly, they had to put some of that aggression aside so they can learn the skills and then channel that aggression and to being what they were.
Because all of this was happening in that time when segregation was so deadly, but they maintained themselves so that they could succeed, even when they had their head in the mouth of the lion, as they say.
And they were the best of the best, as far as I'm concerned. I've known quite a few of them in my chapter and other places. And even our President Obama said that he stands on the shoulders of those airmen.
That's right. And didn't he invite them to the inauguration?
Both of them.
There was a
they
whole,
were both there. They were there for both of them.
Yeah, I remember seeing the whole group of them,
Yep.
and it was humbling to see that our president recognized the importance of what they did, not only for black people but for the country, because the country is better when all of this is erased and improved. But yeah, President Obama made a point of, and I think there was somebody in their hundreds, his age, that came to the inauguration. I seem to remember.
I don't remember. I know that one of the airmen is like 106.
Yeah, yeah, they're up there.
Well, my dad would have been 103 this month.
Wow. And he did his work. Huh?
My mother did make it to 102.
She made it to 102. Okay, that black don't crack. Well, we thank you again
Thank
for
you.
your presence, for your work, for the work of those who support you and work with you, because I know it's not a single, but it's always so good to see the joint success in the Nguzo Saba. The first one is Umoja, unity in the family, community, nation, and race. And you certainly exemplify that unity, and we thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And hope to learn some more about
All right, and we're
these.
always looking for new members.
Okay.
And members don't have to be any particular race, any particular sex, any particular age.
Okay. All right. Will we be able to get in touch with you?
Yes, absolutely.
How do we get in touch with you?
Well, I usually carry business cards with me, but we have a website that we're working on.
You're working on your website?
Yes.
Okay, so very soon we'll be able to
Yes.
Google that and come up with it. Good deal. We appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.